Folkerts has kindly agreed to take some time off from a very busy schedule as dean of the school, and agreed to talk to us about some of her recent research. And just to give you a brief background on Jean, all of you know her, and Jean actually more popularly known, came to us from George Washington a few years ago, and she held a number of different administrative positions at GWU. Jean has degrees from both Kansas and Kansas State, and as most of you already know, she's a very eminent media historian. Published numerous articles in many different mass communication and journalism journals, history journals, I'm sorry. Also has a couple of books which have transcended the influence in terms of time, one of which is co-authored with Dwight Heater, Voices of the Nation, and another one, The Media and Life, which is now in its 4th edition, co-authored with Anne Larrabee and Steve Lacy, which talks about contemporary mass media here. And this influence is pretty much stretched across in so many different areas of mass communication, journalism, history. And Jean has also held several leadership positions in AHMC, and also serves on several editorial boards, besides having served as editor of our flagship journal, Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, for over 10 years. Today she's going to be talking to us about her recent research project on Southern newspaper and ideology of reform. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sri. I could have never remembered that and done it the way they did without notes. So that's great. I told Sri this is a work in progress. This is also an example or a study in what you do when research goes wrong. And so we're going to look at some of the shifts that we're making as we go through this, since it didn't all turn out quite the way that we anticipated. The idea of this project is to look at social reform in the South. Most of the work that's been done on social reform has been done in the Northeast. Some of it in the early 19th century was done also in Chicago, mostly in urban areas. And there was such a focus in the South on slavery, and much of the study of the South has been wrapped around the issue of slavery, that not much attention really was given to things like prison reform, mental hospitals, public education, libraries, public health. And yet, you do see from time to time, as you look through the legislation, that there certainly was a discussion about reform going on in the South. And also the agrarian, of course, and labor farm movements that occurred in the late 19th century were very much indigenous to this area. North Carolina was one of the big players in that, along with some of the plains in the Midwest states like Kansas. My first sort of historical discovery of North Carolina was when I was doing work on the agrarian farm movement when I was working on my dissertation. So what we're trying to do is look at how journalists discuss these issues and what the outcome is in terms of legislation, but we also wanted to make it a bit more complex in looking at a little bit of the layering that goes through this kind of thing. So we're looking at sort of exploring social sites of conflict. Our assumption by looking at the literature on reform was that there would be many differing opinions about mental health and how mentally ill people were treated. There were a number of ways that these issues were addressed, and they were sort of lumped together. Prison reform was lumped with mental illness. Because the mentally ill were often housed in prisons along with the poor. And so the sort of combination of things are, what do we do with people who are mentally ill? And at that time the terms were idiot, insanity, mentally ill was a euphemism or a more accurate term, or however you want to look at it, developed later on. The terminology from the early 19th century, late 18th century is not quite so pleasant. So there was this discussion going on about what should be done with these people. And in that discussion, you usually see things like people are poor because they're lazy, or you see people are poor because the system is against them, or people are poor because of capitalism. So you get sort of 3 different kinds of theoretical strains in terms of how people are thinking about poor people. The same issues with people who are in prison, or how people should be treated in prison, Some people didn't believe in rehabilitation. You should put them in really terrible circumstances for a while so they feel truly punished, and then when they get out, they won't do that again because they don't want to go live in those conditions again. So you see all this range of discussion. So what we're trying to do is pull out all the strands of the discussion and look at the content or the treatment of the issue as it appears in the newspapers. So we hypothesized that discussion in newspapers would reveal a lot of information about editors' positions on social reform, and that could be tied to their status in terms of who these editors were, including their social, political, and economic standing. Now, before this study, I had some experience in looking at editors' economic standing. I was looking at the late 19th century and looking at populist editors, because all of the Republican and Democratic editors at that time period said things like populist editors are hacks, they don't have any training, they're all immigrants, they're really not journalists. And what I was arguing was that they were really denigrating their position as editors because they really wanted to speak against them politically and had very little to do with who they were. And sure enough, when we did all of the demographics and we used census data, the populist editors owned their own houses. They moved from Ohio to further west, just like the other editors did. Some of them did that a little bit later. There were some slight differences. But all of those charges about how these people were just sort of flakes and not journalists and were recent immigrants, which was a very negative term for that time period, turned out not to be true. And Don Shaw actually published, where is he? He actually published that paper in Journalism Quarterly. So we thought, as we found these comments and we looked at these editors, that we would be able to tie some of the commentary to their social and political standing. So we looked at a variety of factors, or we are looking at, we're really in the process now of looking at the editors. What was their socioeconomic standing? What was the locus of each editor's political affiliations? And this is actually pretty easy to do because the papers are so political and party-oriented in that period of time that it's not very hard to discover what the political affiliations of the editor are. And one of the editors, for example, of the North Carolina Standard in Raleigh was this is Whig Democrat time, was a Whig turned Democrat. And he talks in his discourse about his poor upbringing and how the Whigs are pseudo-intellectual and want to eliminate people like him because they don't have as good an upbringing. And so you get a sense of that person's attitude, really, in terms of social issues. We wanted to see how they perceive themselves within their communities. And again, that's not too hard to find if you look at some local histories. You look at the commentary from the editors themselves. You look about what one editor says about another. Because when you're in this time period, you have a newspaper that is basically 4 pages long, and you can read the whole thing because you're not trying to sort through the New York Times that's 90 pages long. And the editors say they're quite vociferous in how they speak about each other, and they call each other names and they put labels on each other. And while you have to discount about 3/4 of it, in the end you can sort of figure out where that person is in the community without too much trouble. So we wanted also to see how they perceive themselves within a local, a regional, and national community. And that's a little more difficult. It's interesting though in that one of the editors in Raleigh, the Raleigh, go back to which paper it is, the Whig paper, Register, is that right, Fatima? The Raleigh Register, was related to the Gales of the Joseph Gales in the National Intelligencer in Washington. So he had a national journalistic connection, whereas it doesn't appear as though the others did. And we're just now kind of working our way through that biography. These are not people about whom book-length biographies have been written, but Fatima has been very successful in locating a number of pieces from the North Carolina Historical Journal and places like that that have short biographies and descriptions of these people. We also wanted to look at who the audiences were. So we look at the editors, the people who create the content, and we look at the audiences and the communities that they serve. And this this part we have really not done much work on yet because we came to some crossroad issues down the road here, and we'll talk about those later. But it is important to kind of look at the different communities. And I think what we're going to find in this study that we're talking about, in some sense, larger communities than we initially anticipated. We anticipated that if you took the editors, for example, taking North Carolina as your pattern, that the editors in Wilmington, the editors in Raleigh, the editors in Fayetteville, which are those three sort of core towns for this time period, would have differing opinions because Wilmington's on the coast, it's got a different kind of economy. Raleigh is the state capital. But so far, we have not seen that happen. And so I think maybe we're talking about a larger community in terms really more of a statewide boundary in this time period, but we don't know for sure yet. And what larger communities did the editor identify with? And again, I said that Gales, for example, I think identified with a larger journalistic community, whereas some of the other editors were very local in their orientation. We thought that we would be able to find enough information that we could look at divisions, harmony within the community. We thought there would be a fair amount of argument in the newspapers about this legislation. You're probably guessing by now that we didn't find a lot of argument because that's exactly what happens to us as we go down the road. So here we're looking at content, and we're trying to think about would we get that language that says, you know, it's morally correct to have a hospital for the insane. It's morally correct to have people in a prison that is clean and well lighted and dry. There were a lot of issues about dampness when you read through these, and evidently people sat in very sort of cold and damp cells. And whether people thought that there was a large movement during this time period where people talk about harmony with the environment. And we thought some of those kinds of issues might appear in the newspaper approach. And then we wanted to look also at how the content was related to subsequent policy development. So just a few things about how you do this. There are lots of ways to determine the social economic standard of editors. And you can use biographies, you can use tax rolls, you can use state histories, and you can use census data. Census data is kind of fun. And in the archives in Washington, there is something called the Soundex. Anybody encountered the Soundex at all? Well, the Soundex is this marvelous index that was created during World War II. It was a make-work job for when we were creating jobs for people, so that more people would be employed during the Depression. And the Soundex was created as an index based on what people's names sounded like. And that's why it's the Soundex. So if you know somebody's name is Miller, you get a more complicated one, but Nagadochi or something. You don't quite know how it's spelled, you go by the sound. And it takes you a while to kind of get onto it when you're looking through the Soundex, but eventually you get there and it sort of becomes second nature. And so you can take, say, 6 editors and look them up in the Soundex. That takes you to the census. And in the census, you can find out how many children they have. You can't find out how much money they made, but you can find out whether they owned land. You can find out whether they paid taxes. You could find out whether they had boarders in their homes, which is an interesting category. So by the time you get all of this data out of the census and put it together, you get a pretty interesting compilation of information about people. And that's what we did when we were working with these editors in the late 19th century, the reform editors. That's how we found out quite a bit about them, actually. And then you go to standard histories to look at what did it mean to have a boarder in your home at that point. Did that mean you were poor and so you had to have extra income? Did it mean you really had a maid who lived in? You have to decide what those kinds of meanings were. I'm sorry, I didn't move mine. It's okay. And the study of the content, we're really doing a qualitative content analysis. As I said, the newspapers are small enough, they're weeklies, that you can get through a year's newspapers when you're looking for specific content pretty quickly. And then looking also at voting patterns will help you determine communities. You know whether a community in that time was basically Whig community, whether it's basically Democratic community or not. And there are some, through the time periods that we were talking about, some kind of heated debates between the Whigs and the Democrats. And the Whigs were really sort of the transcendent party and were elected most of the time, but there's a big turnover, and the We started in the late 1840s, or we started in the 1840s. In the 1840s, only North Carolina and Delaware did not have hospitals for the insane. That means South Carolina had a hospital for the insane, Virginia had two. So North Carolina was considerably behind in that sense. And in the 1840s, the mentally ill were still being housed in jails, or wealthy people might have hired somebody to take care of them, or they would be sent to a hospital in another state. And Dorothea Dix came to Carolina to champion the cause of the mentally ill. And Dorothea Dix had made these trips all over the country, and in the 1830s and 1840s, she traveled through the South. And that was why we picked this starting point, is that we knew that Dorothea Dix had come here in the 1840s. We wanted to look, and we thought we could look at newspaper discussion right around her trip, and we would get this rich source of dialogue about the mentally ill and what should be done with them. What we found is almost nothing during that time period. We found accounts of the legislation, and we found secondary accounts of what happened. But in the newspapers, there really were these very brief descriptions that said, Senator Rayner spoke today, and here's what he said. And then you would have verbatim 3 paragraphs. Actually, what happened was this bill championed by Kenneth Rayner in a speech to the House of Commons in December of 1848 was the beginning of the passing of the bill. And so, lost my place here. I need to click you over. Okay, so Rayner said that made these arguments, and these arguments were made out of what Dorothea Dix had collected and presented to the legislature in what she called a memorial, which was a standard sort of term for the time. It's basically a long written speech that she submits to the House of Commons. And so Rayner then champions her cause. He comes in, he says it would be less expensive to house people in a mental hospital than to house them in jail. And he argued for an institution that would reflect the pride and character of North Carolina. They didn't want some cheap, terrible place for people to stay that they could not be proud of. And at some point, he actually made, either he or one of the others makes an argument, well, it's right here, appeal to the state's desire to be progressive, which I think is really interesting because the whole term, if you're new to North Carolina and you haven't been here a long time, you start hearing the word progressive a lot, and you hear it if you've been here a long time too, but maybe you don't hear it as clearly. But that term has a special meaning, I think, in North Carolina. And there was this very strong desire to be thought of as progressive. But at the same time, they really didn't want to spend any money. That becomes the real baseline. So they argued not to go cheap. Tennessee had gone cheap. They had built this really cheap mental hospital, and it was really terrible, and it wasn't working well, and they really needed at least $100,000 to do it right. So he gets tabled for a while, and people understand the speech, but he just kind of disappears. Not in the newspapers, disappears for a while. And then the bill actually passes in January of 1849. It's defeated in October, but it passes in January, and it is pushed through the House by a prominent Democrat whose name is James Dobbins. And Dix had nursed Dobbins' wife, who was living in the same hotel where Dix was living, and she was dying, and Dix had nursed her through it. And Dobbins' wife's last plea to him was get the House to pass this bill for the mentally ill, because she wanted it for Dorothea Dix, because she had been so kind to her that she was dying. And so Dobbins goes in, and the North Carolina Standard records, and all of the newspapers really record his appeal. And they say he spoke under peculiar circumstances and without preparation, but we only give expression to the voice of all who have heard him. We say that his remarks were exceedingly beautiful, eloquent, and effective. So ingenious and yet so clear were his arguments, and so earnest and so touching were his appeals that he made to the House, that all opposition to the project appeared to vanish into thin air, and the bill almost passed by an almost unanimous vote. So, as it's very flowery 19th century language, it never says the woman was dying, and that the newspaper doesn't say at that time that he made this appeal. I think buried in one article later on, it does mention it, and then it comes out in some of these local October, Dobbins comes back, makes this really emotional plea, and the bill passes. And the lesson in this is that the way legislation is passed is not always rational. So we started looking, at first we were just looking at the Raleigh Register, which is the Whig newspaper. Then we started looking at some others, the Raleigh Standard, which is the person who was first a Whig and then converted to being a Democrat. Looked at the Fayetteville Observer and the Wilmington paper. These seem to be the four major state newspapers at this time. And they really reflect a very shortened, sort of cut and dried version, so that we really don't get this kind of discussion that we want. So we decided we would back up, because we had found in some of the histories that there had actually been lots of discussions about this issue before Dorothea Dix comes. And so we went back to look at as early as 1803. And in 1803, the Raleigh Register is reporting things that are not very progressive in terms of how the mentally ill are thought of or treated. This is not uncommon. I mean, Virginia's hospital, I think, was built in the late 1700s, 1780s, I believe. And that was really the beginning of some change in how the mentally ill were thought of. But because you built a hospital, it still didn't mean that people understood that understood what this was. They, many of them thought it was a physical illness. Some thought it was a cord in your neck that had been snapped, or that you weren't connected right in some way. It wasn't really very good understanding. And so a lot of times the mentally ill, even when the hospitals were built, were not treated really very humanely. If you think about Cherry Hospital today, I think we have some of the same issues going on. But the treatment was basically custodial, and people were appointed really kind of to keep these people from hurting themselves, keep them from hurting others. And as I said before, the wealthy sometimes hired somebody to take them, or they sent people out of state. If you go on and look at the newspapers and the documents, in 1817, the legislature considered a bill to fine husbands who failed to take care of their insane wives. There's no indication that there were any insane husbands the wives had to take care of. Or else the wives just took such good care of them that nobody knew. I'm not sure which. But anyway, it was a sort of interesting bill. And then none of these passed, but in 1818, they also had another bill considered that would send a lunatic to the debtor's room or another room in a public jail. And in 1825, they began to think about a mental hospital and asked somebody to collect information and report a plan to build what they then called a lunatic asylum. It goes on through 1827. The bill was referred to a joint committee, and everybody acknowledged that this would really add luster to the government to protect people who really had been deprived. And here you get a little bit of the social quality of the discourse, but it's in the legislative documents more than it is in the newspapers. And here they say, to protect and cherish the unfortunate individual who by the visitation of God has been deprived of his reason. So this is something that happens by the grace of God, or the lack of grace of God. And they see it as something, you don't see it really tied in that particular comment, though, to it's the person's fault or anything like that. You get a little bit of social commentary, but not much. So then another decade passes, and in the 1838-1839 session of the legislature, we have another resolution that seeks information about an asylum, a penitentiary, and an orphan's home. So the picture of the orphan's home now gets wrapped into the whole social discussion. And then in 1844, Governor Moorhead recommends that the state erect asylums for the deaf, the insane, and the blind. And so you get the discussion about all these groups of people who somehow need to be taken care of and addressed in the social fabric of the community. But there's still not very much real understanding or realization of what it is that you do or how it's improved, or much of the social comment again. And in 1844, the legislature appoints another committee, and they recommended financing it this time from the Internal Improvements Fund. Now, what's interesting about the internal improvements fund is that this is a fund ongoing in early North Carolina that's designed to build roads, do infrastructure basically. And the only thing that the legislature ever seems to allocate money for is internal improvements. And they're very reluctant to tax, they're very reluctant to spend money, and they're very reluctant to take money out of the internal improvement funds for things like the hospital for the insane, and so it doesn't happen. And the legislation dies. And from that point until Dorothea Dix arrives, which is shortly after, nothing else happens. So we now have this picture. We're still looking at some of these earlier dates to see, we haven't gotten through all of the newspapers for the earlier dates. So we're still looking through the newspapers at these earlier legislative points in time that we've identified to see if we can find the kind of discussion that we hoped would reveal that there was, some kind of real philosophical discussion of reform issues. You see it in the Northeast all the time in all of the reform literature. But you also have a lot of reform movements going on. And some of the commentary that comes out of the Northeast reform literature comes out of movement literature. And that's one piece that we haven't looked at in the South or identified really yet, is whether there is, like in the North you have the anti-slavery movements, and the anti-slavery movements and the Bible societies and things like that looked at issues other than anti-slavery, for example. The American Bible Society was very involved in a number of issues. So we have not yet identified whether there's social movement literature in the South that would have discussed these issues in some greater way. So when we go through the rest of the social movement, or try to identify whether there's any social movement literature, finish the work on the newspapers, then what do we do next? We're also working on biographies of editors. And as I said, going back to the earlier newspapers. And then the other state that we're going to look at next is Virginia. And Virginia built an insane asylum much earlier. Virginia had 2 state hospitals actually by the time North Carolina built 1. Just incidentally, after Dorothea Dix comes through and they finally pass the legislation, it's another 5 years before they start construction, and I think another 5 before it's done. So it's 10 years after the legislation is passed before anything really actually exists in terms, because they do a tax and it takes a while to build up the money and build the building and that sort of thing. But we want to look at Virginia because Virginia's economy in this period is quite different from that of North Carolina. It's much more of a planter class. There's a more aristocratic culture around the James River in particular. It's a very different economy. There's actually quite a bit more urbanism in Virginia in the early 1800s than there is in North Carolina. There's a very strong newspaper presence in Richmond with very strong competing newspapers. And so would be interesting to see whether the discussion and the treatment in the newspapers is significantly different from one state to another. It's interesting, I think, that South Carolina also has a hospital before North Carolina does. And the building of these hospitals may represent very different kinds of social philosophies as you go from community to community. And that's what we hoped we would find in the newspaper discussions. Because there's enough indication from the northern reform literature that you might think that in some locales they just want to make sure everybody's out of the way and not going to sort of block the community. Other places there's a genuine interest in actually taking care of people. At that time there's not a lot of faith that people can actually change because there's not much understanding of mental illness. So if we go to Virginia and we do these other things, what will we find? Now, we could find that newspapers are just not very involved. I mean, that's one possibility. That's what looking at North Carolina so far kind of indicates, is that they just kind of reported what happened in the legislature and that was it. There is certainly editorial comment in the newspapers in this period, but it's very political for the most part, and of course wrapped into the news columns and not separate. We could discover, like I said, that it might be very different discussion going from one locale to another, and that the economy and all of these different factors weigh in. And discover really what the communication tool was, because this is, I think, a strong enough issue that it's not something that nobody ever talked about. Couldn't have just been a matter of fact issue, because I think it just comes up too many times in too many situations. So you have to find out then, I think, whether there's another form of community discussion. And that may be through the social movement literature. It may be through sermons. If you go back clear to colonial days, you find a lot of social discussion in sermons. In the Puritan community, you find a lot of social issues and conflict and suggested resolutions of those conflicts appearing in the sermons, both what you should do and what you should not do. And so there's a lot of understanding that it can be gained by those. Or whether you find actually more of it in the legislative discussion on the floor of the House and Senate. So it's been a kind of interesting journey through all of this, and the significance of it, I think, is that we may have been wrong in our hypothesis totally in terms of newspapers being really influential in the discussion of reform issues in the South. And we may find that other kinds of communication were more important in the communities. Or we may find that it just really differs from one community to another. North Carolina during this time period is very focused on internal improvements, very focused on infrastructure. The Whigs are very reluctant to tax anybody. There's not a strong social movement culture, I don't think. We have not identified one yet. So in another environment, we know in the North, if you go to Massachusetts, for example, there's a strong movement culture that addresses some of these issues. And it may be that we haven't discovered that yet in the South. So questions? John?
How do you know that Mrs. Dix left that death wish?
It is, that one is from a local history, and it did appear in one of the newspapers, didn't it? Isn't that where it came from?
Context of it. So what it was I first found it in the newspaper. They had mentioned that it was in some relation to a family member or something, that he was moved, and this. Then I followed up, and God bless the Southern Historical Foundation, because they can find anything, my goodness. But they found where there was a small biography, and he mentioned it. And later, like maybe 50 years later, there's another article that referenced this experience as well in the paper. So it was found and pieced together through 3 different sources, starting with the newspaper making one-line statement about it.
Is it possible that, I'm asking both authors here, is it possible that journalism, which was not really much of a profession in the 1840s, self-identified awareness, that you have these kinds of issues rise when they became more identified, self-aware as being journalists, when they came later?
It's a really good question. So that maybe they saw themselves more just as reporters at this point, or
Yeah,
political
so-
commentators.
And so that actually we're engaging in a little bit looking back at, because you find very little discussion of slavery, and you have very little discussion of women in the period of 1820, 1860, which is almost nothing in there about it. Other than, like your example of, well, here's my example. Senator Jones came to Paducah today and spoke. He was accompanied by his wife, not mentioned.
of Maine?
Could be. They were more in the north, not exclusively, but wouldn't you say, Frank? More so? Oh, yeah.
And then I'm thinking also if the women in the movement didn't think of themselves as a social movement, but just thought that it was more kind of personal, not political.
I think they knew it was political, but, I mean, if you read the movement literature from the north anyway, they knew it was political. And there is written literature, but what we haven't discovered here yet is any real written literature about it. Now, if it's done through women's clubs, we might find it through the women's clubs literature too. There's another place to look.
So David, I wonder if you could introduce our guest to the group there. We have a visiting faculty member from Indiana.
Ah.
This is Emily Metzger, just in her first year at Indiana, and her PhD at LSU. She and Joanne Long, who graduated from the doctoral program here, are visiting today and tomorrow.
Right, welcome. Frank?
I was interested in, and some work I'm doing looks at the question of whether or not Southern newspapers themselves were different from the North. I'm looking at, particularly at the phenomenon of printers' festivals, and I find far more mention of them in the North and what was then the West, now our Midwest, and some, but very slight mention in Southern newspapers. And I'm just wondering, you were talking about how do they perceive themselves within a local, regional, or national community of journalists and journalistic standards, and I'm wondering if the question is maybe not only within, but as a local community of journalists. Do you have any sense of a difference between a New England newspaper?
The only sense you get of the national community is the Gales connection. Otherwise, it's what I saw in some early Kansas stuff when they're doing the border fighting in Kansas, where you've got two highly politically charged editors who are calling each other names. And so that's very similar to, and I've lost my dates now, when's the Kansas-Nebraska bill? Something now,
1820 when they divided it, I think 1820.
And you see similar division on political grounds, but here, I mean, we haven't seen as heated a commentary here. Those were just outright you yellow jacket, bully tail, stupid idiot editor across the road. I mean, it just was bizarre language, totally. And we haven't seen as much of that here. Do you remember seeing it, Fatima?
No.
It's more restrained.
It's very restrained.
It's really almost like an account of the legislature. And then you also see some other accounts of things, but it's very, very restrained for the most part, what we've seen so far. Joan?
I was interested in the appeal to North Carolina being a progressive state. And it seems to me that the state does have a reputation for putting a lot into education. And I wondered if there was any parallel discussion in the newspapers about the importance of education.
Well, the team and I looked, when we were looking through the papers, we looked for education, prison reform, orphanages, hospitals for the insane, anything that we thought kind of fell in that reform education category. And there was not much.
It only really came up when they would discuss it in the House.
It really was a reaction to the
It was very hard
legislature.
newsy. It was very hard newsy. There was no real sort of discussion around these issues. That's what we kept searching. We went back to see if there was even previous discussion the decade before, but there was, like, looking through that, I could not find any discussion on these reforms.
It's very reactive. It's like an account of what happened in the legislature, or an account of what happened in a discussion of city council. I mean, they even call issue would be the money, and that was right. The only issue seemed to be the money.
Gee, when you talk about other communication tools here,
Mm-hmm.
are you talking about mass or interpersonal forms of communication?
I'm talking about mass, or maybe what we would now call targeted, in terms of flyers, little booklets were a common kind of thing. If you might have had a women's club booklet on social reform, something like that might appear somewhere.
Okay, a related question then.
Suffrage press might have had something about it.
In your analysis, the previous bullet point, you talked about how influence could have varied according to the economic and social stratification there.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be that, based on analysis, we find that interpersonal social communication had more of an influence on many people compared to some, and that was actually going through some channels of flow? Could you then potentially suggest that your analysis could provide some historical presage to what Lazarus later came up with in terms of empirical evidence for two-step flow?
Mm-hmm. It's real possible. It's, and then I think to look at that, you've got to really look at one, like just take Raleigh and look at it really micro. Look at city documents, and get a real micro look at anything that's preserved from that period, and go and look at it from that point of view, because you might be able to trace, who speaks the most often, what position that person holds, and go through a kind of hierarchy of influence then, too.
But then letters would matter then too, wouldn't they?
Yeah, letters matter too. And that's another area that we haven't done, is that we haven't done the manuscript files, like to take Rayner and do his manuscript files so it's one of those things I think we just have to find out where it's located. Frank and Deb?
Nancy Hewitt, I think she's still at Rutgers, did a really interesting study of Rochester, New York, asking questions somewhat similar to this. And although her focus was not on media, it was interesting that, and it was on women's activities in this period. What was interesting, the sort of the subtext was the lack of media involvement. So it was not a big issue for them. They did it themselves interpersonally.
And I think that may well be what you find here, is it's just going through a whole different channel. And it speaks to Lucila's point about it being a gender issue, and that if it was a women's movement basically, and if they didn't have access to the newspapers that much, then they would be used a different channel.
But they have some of their own publications.
Yeah.
Do you think there are government reports that would document, I know you were looking at only newspapers, but.
No, we've been looking at government stuff too. That's where we got a lot of the legislation stuff, was out of the government documents, legislative documents.
And were there any activist groups that were working for?
We haven't seen any yet, but, we haven't done a real exhaustive search of that yet either. The activist groups, I think, in North Carolina come along later, which I think goes along with Paul's sleepiness period as being
And it's somewhat a matter of definition too, is what rises to the level of activist group.
That's true.
So if the newspapers were not influential regarding reform issues, what were they influential about? I mean, political issues, you would
Well,
think.
first you have to prove that they are influential. But they certainly do. If you take Raleigh, for example, where they're competing newspapers, they represent different political sides. And that's clear. One of them supports Henry Clay, and one of them taunts the other editor a little bit, who had switched sides for having once supported Henry Clay and no longer supporting Henry Clay. So changing sides had become an issue. It was an issue then, just like it is now. But it's a kind of restrained political representation, I would say, at that point. And part of it, I think, is if you go back that far in the history of the country, these newspapers are really in the process of building a political system. They are affiliated with parties in the sense of really quite experimental yet. It's not very old. And so there's a lot of just experimentation about what political parties are going to mean. The newspapers kind of shore up the political parties in some ways. And, you know, for many, many, many years, I mean, way into the 20th century, editors are really in politics very deep. That's a very recent phenomenon that editors are not, no matter what. When they start calling themselves independent in the 1930s or so, they're still affiliated with parties. They just aren't paid by the party anymore. And so they called themselves independent, but they were independent only in terms of where their finances were or were not coming from. Yes.
In China, we call our southeast part as our booming region. Not only because of the economy, but also the development of the newspaper. And so we have the division of the first part is the southeast of China. We are very brave. I am in the media, brave independence and exposing some bad things. And the second part is the north. And maybe the last is the west. So I'm interested in your title. If you said Southern newspaper in America, what does the people's impression? And will you have the division like us in China?
There's certainly a division. Do you mean what would people's impression be of the Southern newspapers, the Southern press, or of the South? Of the region or of the newspapers?
The Southern press.
Southern press. Well, a lot of the histories argue that have been argued that the Southern press was more backward than the rest of the press. It was slower to adapt to new technology, slower to organize with each other, recognize some journalistic affiliations across with other newspapers. I don't think there's any indication in this time period that they were more or less free to express their ideas. When you get closer to, although actually by 1840, you get into the 1850s, certainly there's a lot of concern about the whole slavery issue, which gets twisted into how freely newspapers express ideas or don't express ideas. But I think this is a little early for that. Think so, Margaret? A little early still for that.
Would it be possible to raise another issue that I'm just struck by our tendency in this century to want to study media that have some kind of social effect. Does it make a difference if they were important newspapers, or if they were leading editors, or anything else? If you're trying to go back, if you're trying to do kind of an intellectual reconstruction of what they were thinking, because the document is the newspaper only residue is captured here and there of the kind of thoughts that are around. Because you know how it came out. I mean, you know how the story was passed or not passed. So you're trying to just reconstruct the kind of thinking that through some mechanism with it. Because even if you did establish, you'd never be able to establish then any more than today that this newspaper covers that shift.
Influential is really the wrong word. You're really trying to figure out the communication process, what the ideas were and how they were communicated to the community. Really.
Basically, what
You're right,
the
you should
ideas
take the word
were,
influential out of it.
were the ideas there, were they coherent? Are they in any other type of document? Because it's like Barbara was saying, I mean, there were not so much in the South, but there were some publications that the kind of issue you're talking about is most likely to have been reflected in its own separate small circulation publication. So in
existed, but, you know, there aren't a lot, so. But you're right, we're really not looking to see, when I use the word editors being influential, and I should pick another word, what I'm really looking for is whether editors through their newspapers conveyed certain ideas because of their economic or social standing, or political reasoning.
That makes sense.
In terms of whether they generated that kind of comment in the community.
Right.
Well, that idea of being proactive or reactive.
Yeah. Because I don't think that, I think it would be folly to try to argue that they made the legislation happen in any way. And that would not be the intent, certainly.
So here's a question for both of you. Are you a little disappointed the newspapers were more forthright in this social issue? Are you
Yes,
disappointed?
that was our hypothesis, so I was ticked. I'm like, what? I'm looking at microfiche forever, I'm like, somebody say something, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I was pretty, I thought it would be a lot more. I thought this issue would be a big issue, especially since this reform was linked with, you know, orphanages and the poor and, you know, just really the marginalized, downtrodden of the community. And I didn't see very much talk of any of those people in the paper. So I think that with our initial hypothesis, I think it was, I don't know if Dean Folkerts felt the same way. I think I was a little bit frustrated. I came back to her several times ago and they're not saying anything. What do we do now? And she's like, okay, we gotta reroute. And I'm
It
like,
sounds like you've got beyond disappointment and you're now mad.
yeah. About 7 days of grief here.
But I think
all over here.
it's why these projects can sometimes be ongoing for a while. Jane?
Well, do you consider it still journalism history if there's nothing in these newspapers and then you have to go to the smaller media?
Oh,
or
sure.
They're not really, then.
Oh, sure, I consider pamphlets, sermons, everything. You know, it's communication, it's not journalism, and I think in many ways it is journalism.
Or do you think the fact that they didn't say anything is part of journalism history? The fact that
Yeah.
there was
Sure is.
Definitely.
the talk of these people is journalism history. They were not mentioned unless it was in a hard, newsy, legislative manner. These people were not addressed in the mainstream press. And so I think that is journalism history in and of itself. Maybe frustrating to do the work, but impactful.
It's like the suffrage press, the suffrage press is movement literature, but it's journalism, I mean,
I think if you map that to the economic conditions of the state, whether it improved or didn't, that you might find that really interesting. Because this period, when they refused to legislators spend any state money, was the crappiest time in the entire state. That's why I got this ripped out of the whole thing. It was a big breakthrough, I think, at the end, is the North Carolina Railroad was pretty Mickey Mouse
That's interesting.
compared to the rest of the country. So it's this time in which they didn't take advantage of any of their resources. And in fact, it took us, even though North Carolina was designated in some way during the Civil War, was so crappy anyway in a lot of ways.
It's interesting because there was a major study of Richmond, or Virginia, and I can't give you the site out of my head, but that traced urbanism in Virginia before the Civil War and argued that there was considerably more urbanism than people had thought in the South in general and in Virginia, but not in North Carolina. And I had looked at papers in the 1830s in Washington. It was the Georgetown Advocate and the Alexandria, might have still been the packet, I can't remember. But these little papers that were the Georgetown paper, the Alexandria paper, they were little parts around DC. And they were commenting on, you know, why should we build things for the poor because they're poor and because they don't work. And you get a lot of social kind of philosophy in the comments in these papers. And so I was struck by the absolute absence of it when we saw it here. And I initially had intended to do Virginia first, and for obvious reasons, we decided we'd do North Carolina first. So maybe, but I think our next step is really to look more at, see if we can find any kind of movement literature here, and then look at another state.
Can I ask one more question? Because I was struck by, you said that a lot of the more satisfying discussion of these issues was in the legislature and in the legislative proposals themselves. And there's a lot of literature about legal discourses a way that they were influencing how the law developed.
You know, it's really interesting because, you know, the editor of the Standard, the Democratic paper in Raleigh, started life basically as a very poor kid who was, I think, sort of an orphan even, who was a printer's devil for a paper in Hillsborough.
Was that Holden?
W.W. Holman?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he gets disgraced later on. I didn't go into his sort of downfall and disgrace later on, but, so he may come at it from a more stenographic point of view at that point in his life. Now, he gets very politically involved later on. There's a big scandal there. He
Ends up being a governor.
yeah.
But he was on every side of every issue.
Yeah. This must have been his early switching, but he does, and he ends up badly, but, there's some of the evolution from printer to editor going on, as opposed to the person that comes at it from an intellectual point of view too. But Gales, I think, comes at it more from, it's an interesting thing about the legal discourse though. Yeah, and I don't know that literature, but I did know that. Other questions? Well, it's fun to weave your way through anyway and discover what some of the editors are like, and it's a sort of unfolding map. So the team is quitting for a while because it's called dissertation, which comes first. So we're going to let her do her dissertation, and we'll keep plugging away at it. Both I will and maybe with some other people. So, and then if the team gets done, she might join us back. So.
Yes.
But we're going to make her